Hey everyone, welcome to another Go With The Flow. In this episode, we are going to talk a little bit about subflows and approvals. Sometimes you have an approval process that is just complex in its own right, and to put it in with the rest of a medium to complex catalog item means you're going to have just tons and tons of nodes in your flow, and it would be really nice if it was nice and clean and compartmentalized. So I borrowed this example from the community where they said, I have a request item and I have an approval group for the request item. And if the person who's submitting it is the only person in that approval group, we want to skip the approval, go right to doing the tasks. Otherwise, if there's more than just the submitter in the group, or if there is people in the group that are not the submitter at all, we want to generate an approval, and if the approval succeeds, only then will we move on to the tasks. Otherwise, we do nothing. So maybe this isn't an approval that you would use at your organization, but it's complex enough we could use it as an example to build a subflow out of. We're also trying something new on this episode. I've already gone ahead and created the flows, and we're just going to talk about the flows that I built.
So that you don't have to watch me type out everything into each field, because you have better things to do than that. And oh my gosh, that's so totally boring.
Let's start with the subflow, and I'm going to walk you through this bit by bit. So subflows always start with inputs and outputs. Let's check out what we've got here. So I am expecting two inputs from whatever calls this subflow. The first input is submitter, and it is going to be a reference to the user table, and it is mandatory. I want to capture who submitted this requested item and have that as a submitter passed to this approval subflow. Then I am also going to pass the source RITM. This is really handy to have, especially if you're going to be putting approvals against the RITM. It pays to have the RITM there. Also, you might want to use variables for different logical pathways, so it just pays when you're using a subflow to feed it whatever task the original flow is on. Now, we also expect outputs. I have two outputs, one of which is pretty obvious, like what is the approval? Was this thing approved or not? And it's going to be a string, but we've also got an output called approval posture, because there are cases within this flow where I don't want an approval to generate at all, and I will be evaluating that before I even evaluate the approval. So we have inputs and outputs. They're very easy to build. You just hit this plus sign and you fill out the name and what type it is and whether or not it's mandatory. So if you remember, as stated, the flow was if the submitted by is the only member of the approval group, then we just want to go right past. You can't really do that in one statement. You can't find out if there's only one person in that group and is it, let's say, Bob. So the first thing I want to do is look up group member records, where group is the random approval group. Random approval group is just a group I made up for this use case. You might also pass in an approval group as a subflow input. Very simple setup here. It's using the lookup records action. It's in the table of sysuser gr member, which is the membership table. We have the group is random approval group. I just selected that right from the list. Now, the second thing I want to do is a second lookup on the group membership table. And this is going to be a lot more specific lookup. It's going to look up if there is a gr membership for the submitted by in the group of random approval group. Let's take a look at that. Again, it's using the action of lookup records, and its conditions are the user is the submitter. What submitter? That's coming from our subflow inputs. So whatever workflow is feeding this subflow, it's going to pass in a user reference, and that's going to get stored in our submitter input, which we created at the top of the show. And the group has to be random approval group. So I'm specifically looking for the submitted by to be a member of the group. Remember, it's not enough that they be a member of the group, it's that they're a member of the group and only they are a member of the group. So now it's time to use those two lookups in an if statement. So I've got a simple if statement here. I've put in a conditional label of approval group only has submitter as an approval. And the way I'm doing this is figuring out, is the count of my first lookup 1? Basically, does that group only have one member? And the second condition is that only one member equal to their submitted by. And so if both of the lookups only have one record return, we know that both statements are true. And if that's the case, we want the approval to skip. So what I'm going to do is populate that subflow output to approval posture of skipped. So here's our assigned subflow outputs. You can find that under flow logic, not actions. So we're taking the approval posture flow output and we are setting that to skipped. And that should end our flow if it goes down that path. Otherwise, what happens if either of these two numbers are greater than 1? Well, if either of those two numbers are greater than 1, we know there's either more members in the group or our submitted by isn't in the group at all, in which case we want to ask for an approval. So of course, our first action after the else is ask for approval. This is pretty conventional. We're going to use the ask for approval action. And what record are we going to approve? We need to approve the RITM that's going to fire this whole thing in the first place. So we had better grab our subflow input of the source request item. Then we're going to set the rules of approve when anybody in the random approval group approves. So I just used this add group button and I selected the group manually. Again, you might be feeding in an approval group into this subflow and you would just use your subflow inputs to put that in. Okay, so now our subflow is going to wait and see if that approval happens. And if it does, what I want to do is take the results of the approval and set that to our output, which is called approval. So if I go to my assign subflow outputs, again, this is flow logic, not flow action. We're going to take the approval subflow output and we are going to populate it with whatever the results of number 6 was. So I'm just going to do this manually so you can see what I did. So you see in node 6, we asked for approval. I'm just going to take the approval state and I'm going to drop it into that output. So the output is going to be whatever the approval is after we've asked for approved. Or our output is going to be this approval posture of skipped. Okay, you might be thinking, Robert, that's a crazy approval workflow. We would never do that. It's okay. I'm just demonstrating to you an exotic approval that we could showcase so that you know you can use a subflow. Would you really want to pack in all 7 of these nodes into the requested item before you even started talking about all the tasks and stuff that you're going to have in there? So we've designed our subflow. Let's go to the flow and call it. So here I have a flow called thing flow, and it's meant to happen whenever I trigger the thing generator catalog item. We've already got our triggers set up. So the first thing I've done is I've actually called that exotic approval. If you want to know how to call a subflow, you just click this add action flow logic or subflow and just pick subflow, and then you'd pick your flow from the list. So I've called the subflow. Let's see what that looks like. So I've selected exotic approval number 1. That's the name of our subflow. And it has asked us for 2 things. Number 1, who's the submitter? And number 2, what's the source RITM? How did it know to ask us that? Now, if you remember back in the subflow, we designed those 2 inputs. So whatever inputs you put on a subflow, whenever you embed that subflow in a flow, those inputs are going to be asked for in that flow. So when it asked us who the submitter is, we just took the submitted by of the triggering requested item. And when it asked us for the source RITM, we just dragged over the requested item record. Okay, so we know that the subflow is going to do everything we need for the approval. So our main flow is waiting for the results of that so we can decide whether it needs to do a thing or not. So we've got an if statement here. It says if approved or skipped. Okay, so what we have here is 2 conditions, and those 2 conditions are based off the outputs of our subflow. Remember, in the subflow, we set the approval posture and we also set the approval, depending on if we needed an approval or not, and whether it was approved or not. So we know that it has been approved if the approval output is approved. So we would drag approval over here into our conditions and mark that as is approved, or if the approval posture is skipped. So we move approval posture output from our subflow node over to the condition and we mark it as is skipped. And from then on, it's plain old ordinary service catalog stuff. Which tasks do you want to do in order? I also put in an else statement because it could be that it was neither skipped nor approved, but rather rejected. And in that case, it's going to make an else statement and it's going to update the requested item with some comments that say, sorry, this wasn't approved. Always a good idea to put that kind of stuff into your comments or your work notes. Now, let's use my favorite part of Flow Designer, the testing mechanism. I'm going to test this as myself. I am not a member of that random approval group, so this should ask for an approval, and if approved, it should then start by generating one of these tasks in sequence. So let's test. Grab that last request item. Here we are on the test results, and we can see that that exotic approval subflow is waiting. How awesome is that? But oh no, how do we figure out what our exotic subflow is doing? Why don't we click the open subflow context? All right, now we see that it has done both the lookups and it has run the if statement. That if statement has resolved in false because I am not the only member of that random approval group. So it's gone down the else path, no problem. Now let's ask for the approval, and it's generated an approval record. Let me go back to the request item and see. Oh, there's an approver. So Bob blah blah has been asked to approve, and it's not run the assigned subflow outputs yet. So it has no need to because it's still waiting for that approval to happen. So why don't we go over to our request item? Let's mark this as approved. We go back to our subflow and we're going to refresh. Now we see that it has completed that ask for approval. What has it done after that? It's assigned the subflow outputs. It has taken the approval output and set the words as approved. Now we can go back to our parent flow output. Here we are in there. Let's refresh that. It evaluated that if statement as true, and now it has initiated the first catalog task. Let's go back to our request item, and we see that it has generated the first of those 2 catalog tasks. Now you should always test all the pathways of your flows, and so what we should do is figure out what happens if the submitted by is actually the only member of that group. So I have this user, his name is Robert blah blah, his friends call him Bob, and Bob blah blah has gone ahead and created a request item in the thing launcher. Bob blah blah is also the only member of the random approval group. So what we should expect is that this flow has skipped all the way to the create tasks and not generate an approval. And if we inspect this record, we see that no approvals have been generated and the first task of the flow has happened. And there you have it, folks. Basically, subflows allow you to define inputs and outputs. So a main flow can send inputs to the subflow can send its output back, and you can use those just like any other variable or data element in your flows. Hope you learned something useful in that, and I will see you on the next one.
If you're a ServiceNow expert looking for better opportunities, but maybe your resume or LinkedIn profile isn't doing you justice, reach out to me via LinkedIn or the email pictured here, as I offer both career coaching and recruitment services. And if you're a ServiceNow customer or partner, you heard that right. Robert Fedoruk now does ServiceNow recruiting. With a 1,500 subscriber YouTube channel and mailing list, and thousands of LinkedIn followers, let's make sure your open positions get first go at the prodigious pool of ServiceNow resources. Reach out via the email pictured here.